ReLearning Community. It is a new initiative of MCEC, and it's funded by our Legacy Initiative funds. And it's intended to help congregations to be more intentional about discipleship making. It is a missional approach that was started in Europe by 3D Movement, and its approach is to engage leaders in congregations to shift from institution to people, and particularly to make disciples and to be a witness of Jesus to our neighbors. I'm going to call upon Henry Patekow, and he's going to tell us more about this initiative.
Thank you. And I'm here to introduce others who will say more about ReLearning Community. Making disciples. Making disciples not only in the church and in our homes, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, where we work and live and play. During a listening tour of about half of our congregations about 4 years ago, that was one of the themes that we heard repeatedly. Help us to learn to be disciples who make disciples. And so in response, the Mission Council and others of us discerned together how we might more effectively support our congregations in doing that. We learned about 3DM, three-dimensional ministry in Europe, which has a vision and a mission to create a culture of disciple-making, a culture of disciple-making. To train, to equip, to nurture, support disciple makers who bring God's love to life by living and loving as Jesus did, by growing more into the image of Jesus as a disciple maker, and to help others to do the same. And so we invited 3DM to come to Canada to work with us, to teach us and train us, to help us work with our congregations in learning to be more faithful and effective disciple makers. In October 2014, that initiative began with congregational teams, including pastors, from about a dozen congregations who committed themselves to growing as disciples into the likeness of Christ, but not only in who they are, we are, as better Christians, but as disciples who know how to share our faith so that we invite others to be disciples as well. And that began a 3-year initiative. Reflecting today on that journey, we've had about 15 congregations join in that learning exercise with us. ReLearning Community, disciple making, changing the culture of our congregations to make disciples not only among ourselves, but in our communities, to be missionaries and disciple makers wherever we are. And so this evening, 4 participants in ReLearning Community will share about their experience and something about ReLearning Community. Kevin Peters Unrau, one of the pastors at Hillcrest Mennonite in New Hamburg, will tell us a little more about one of the learnings in ReLearning Community that's equipping us in this enterprise. And then we'll hear 3 stories. Andrea Warkentin from the Leamington United Mennonite Church, Noramy Gonzalia from the First Mennonite Church in Kitchener, and Norm Dick, a pastor at Listowel Mennonite Church. All congregations who've been engaged, are engaged in this ongoing journey of learning how to be disciple makers. Please.
Good evening, everyone. A lot has been said about the paradigm shift that the church in North America has been experiencing and is expected to continue to experience over the next number of years. In fact, we hear it so often it has almost become cliche. Nonetheless, I am the kind of person that can welcome a good conversation around these kinds of things and get wrapped up in it. However, there are also moments where I get tired of the conversation and want to say, okay, that's fine, we're willing to talk about it endlessly, but what are we going to do about it? And one of the things that I have been involved in responding to this what are we going to do about it question has been the ReLearning Community process. And what drew me in to this ReLearning Community opportunity, the hook, if you will, was when I read the following line in one of the books that's produced through 3DM. And it said simply this: if you make disciples, you always get the church. But if you make a church, you rarely get disciples. If you make disciples, you always get the church. But if you make a church, you rarely get disciples. And so that drew me in. I said, okay, this is a conversation worth having. Whether I get anything out of it in the long run, it doesn't matter. This is a conversation I need to enter into. And so this has been a 3-year conversation that I have been involved in with some of the folks from 3DM Europe, but also people sitting in the chairs here this evening. And it's been good to develop those relationships over the past 3 years. But what I learned early on in the ReLearning Community experience was this: anytime people hire experts to do anything for them, what we're really, really hoping deep down in the center of our souls is that these brilliant people are going to come up with a complex solution that none of us could ever have predicted. And this solution is going to be easy, and it's going to be quick, and it's going to solve everything. Yes, wouldn't that be lovely? But the reality is that solutions, as they come to us in the real world and not Hollywood, is that they are simple, they are difficult, and that they are long-term. And so through the ReLearning Community process, I have learned that change is about culture and character, not structure and program. Change comes through culture and character. Programs and structure you can change in 6 to 18 months. We were told right from the beginning, 10 years would be good. Culture and character change much more slowly, but fortunately, they also change much more permanently. Thus, the emphasis on discipleship. Now, Mennonites like talking about discipleship, but do we actually know what we mean when we start throwing this word around? What is this biblical notion of discipleship? Well, one of the passages in the Bible that we might refer to is the good old Micah 6:8 passage. God has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. 3 dimensions there. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. And in the 3DM circles, they talk about this as a triangle. The up, in, and out triangle. Up towards God, in towards our community, and out toward the world. And those 3 dimensions reflect an emphasis on attentiveness, on accountability, and on relationship. So I want to spend a little bit of time this evening taking a look at these 3 dimensions of this triangle. But just before we jump into that, I want us to take a step back one more time and talk about this discipleship piece. Because as much as it's helpful to talk about some specifics and some concrete things that we can sink our teeth into to get our hands on, it's also helpful to remind ourselves that in the big picture, discipleship comes down to looking at Jesus and living lives that look like his. So any framework that we put on this to help us understand or do this more effectively isn't for its own sake. It's because discipleship is looking at Jesus and making our lives look like his. And furthermore, we want to be disciples that make disciples that can make disciples. In the natural world, the stability of a species is determined by its ability to produce fertile offspring, not just offspring. And I think one of the concerns that we have in the church right now is that we might be able to produce offspring. We might be able to have kids that will grow up in the church, but will their kids grow up in the church? Will there be a generation after the one that we're modeling for and engaging right now. And so it's not just that we want to make disciples, we want to make sure that those disciples can make disciples, and so on and so forth. So I actually want to turn to one of the stories of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, and begin by looking at this up dimension of this triangle, the walking humbly piece, the piece where we are paying attention, being attentive to how God is present in our world. And it comes from Luke chapter 6, beginning in verse 12. These, for those of you who need the reminder, are the verses leading right up to the Sermon on the Plain, which is Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. So that's where we're situated here in Luke chapter 6. Now, during those days, Jesus went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. Jesus grounded himself in attention to the up. And there's any number of places you could start in, or point to in Scripture where this is one of the things that Jesus does. And so it's important to realize that this little passage that I'm going to be focusing on in the next couple of minutes begins with Jesus paying attention to God. This is foundational to the Christian experience. We have to be paying attention to God. And although in this case Jesus is praying, it's never just about prayer. Remember, the Micah 6:8 invitation was to walk humbly with your God. Not to talk humbly with your God, to walk humbly with your God. And when we walk humbly with our God, it's the way we are present to God in every moment of our life. What is God showing me and growing in me in this moment, no matter where you are? And so as we think of developing this up direction, this up corner of our triangle, we are at times, through the ReLearning Community process, invited to reflect on some questions that are there to help us develop that part of our discipleship journey. Questions like, do I make enough space for prayer? Do I pursue intimacy with Jesus? Do I still feel pleasure? Am I living in a state of peace? Well, that's the up dimension. Now what about the in? The, as Micah 6:8 put it, the mercy, or as some translations have it, loving kindness. What about that dimension? What about the accountability aspect of the relationship? Well, Luke 6 continues on in verse 13. And when day came, Jesus called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James and John and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas and James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who is called the Zealot, and Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. What does mercy, or as the other translations put it, loving kindness, what does loving kindness look like in the context of Judas? What does mercy look like in the context of Judas? I love the fact that those names are all listed there, and we have this reminder in the midst of all of this. Because I think those are the challenges. It's easy to figure out what it means to love mercy, to exude loving kindness when everything's going well in our churches, in our communities. But it's never always going well in our communities. There's always something up. That's the challenge. Otherwise, it would be easy. We wouldn't be here asking these questions. Judas is not the expected person to be thinking about when we start talking about mercy and loving kindness. But as the great Asian philosopher Bruce Lee once said, I'm not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you're not in this world to live up to mine. And I actually think in those words, he captured something of Jesus. Because Jesus certainly didn't live up to anybody's expectations of the day. And Jesus seems to love us no matter whose expectations we manage to collapse. So although Bruce Lee said it, I think Jesus would probably agree with it. I'm not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you're not in this world to live up to mine. So does that mean that accountability just has no role? No, absolutely not. The in corner of the triangle is the place where we ask one another, how is God messing with your life, and what are you going to do about it? Not what I think you should do about it. What are you going to do about it? Low expectations, high accountability. Because in 2 weeks, this circle is going to meet again. And we're going to look at you and we're going to say, so 2 weeks ago you said you were going to do this. How did that go? And the kinds of questions that we ask ourselves to help develop that in corner of the triangle are questions like this. Is my family happy? Is time a blessing or a curse? Am I sleeping and eating well? Am I making myself vulnerable to others? Out. Doing justice. Relationship. The story in Luke continues in verse 17. Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. They had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And all in the crowd were trying to touch him, for power came out of him and healed all of them. There is a difference between welcoming and receiving relationship versus offering and extending relationship. So permit me to tell you two stories. One's about me and one's about you. The first one is about me welcoming relationship. Pretend for a moment that a new family moves into my neighborhood, and I bake a lovely pie and put it together with a gift card for home hardware, because there's always something that needs to be bought or fixed when you move into a new home. And I take the gift card and the pie, and I wrap it up beautifully, and I put it on my kitchen table, ready to give to the new family the first time they come over. And then I wait, and nothing happens. So I go back to the home hardware where I got the gift certificate, and I buy a welcome mat, and I put it in front of my door. And I also get some fresh flowers, and I put them in a vase and plant them in my yard to be more inviting. And then I wait. And the pie and the gift card still sit on my table. And then it dawns on me. I need to literally open the door for folks here. So I prop the front door open, and every once in a while I yell out, "Come on in!" But still nothing happens. And by now, the pie is weeks old, and I've had to use the gift certificate to replace the leaking tap in the bathroom, and I'm angry at my neighbors for refusing my quality hospitality. That's called making the relationship all about me. Now here's the story about you extending relationship. You also bake a pie, and you also buy a gift certificate, but you bring it over to the new folks. And maybe no one is home, so you leave it on the porch with a note. Or perhaps they are home and you introduce yourselves and you chat at the door for a minute before they politely excuse themselves to finish unpacking. Or just maybe they're home and they greet you. And they welcome you into their home and you chat for hours. And after that visit, maybe you know you've just found great new friends. Or maybe after that visit, you know these are the strangest folks you've ever met and wonder how on earth this is going to work out with them being next door neighbors. But however it turns out, it only happens because you stepped out of your comfort zone into theirs. That's called making the relationship about others. And when we start thinking about what it is to do justly, to extend our relationships into the community, we start asking questions of ourselves like this. Do I have a vision? Am I a servant? Am I dying to success? Can I take risks? Of course, those stories are nice and neat. And life is never nice and neat. So I'm going to tell you one little story about what this looks like in the messiness of life. As much as I have heard the call over the last 3 years to extend myself into my community, and I have been trying to make changes in that direction, to tell you the truth, I suffer, like many of us here, of being way too darn busy. And I am not, it turns out, a good steward of my time that allows me to extend myself into places that I don't work or sleep. And so a lot of my work over the last couple of years has actually been learning to trim out good things, meaningful things, in order for me to make room to extend myself out into the community. Of course, life still intervenes in these sorts of places. So as I'm talking to God and saying, God, okay, God, help me to get rid of the stuff that I'm used to, open up some new avenues and so on. Ah, darn, there's another thing on the calendar. And what is it? Oh, my kid's speed skating. I love my kids speed skating, but it means that I have to go and do these bingos 4 or 5 times a year. And I tell you, when you go to bingo and watch people who don't have money spend money, it is a soul-sucking experience. And it's like, oh, not another evening of bingo. So you drag yourself out the door, and then you spend 3 hours, 4 hours walking on hard tile floors with your feet aching, and you realize, oh, I forgot to take the Advil before I left. And you just really become horribly resentful. Until at one moment in the break in the action, you stand at the back of the room, and there's a couple other volunteers there, and you get talking, and somehow, in the middle of a blinking bingo hall, you end up talking about the fact that this one person lost their first spouse before they were 40 years old. And lo and behold, the other volunteer standing on my other side says, well, that's interesting, because I also lost my first spouse before they were 40. Different diseases, similar experience. So there we are, standing at the back of the blankety-blank-blank bingo hall, having the conversation that I've been asking God to have. I didn't want to have it in a bingo hall. I wanted to have it someplace interesting, like with my neighbors, people I would see again. But guess what? We don't get to choose when and where holy moments happen. They just happen. And the invitation is for us to make ourselves open and available to it everywhere, all the time. That's what it means to walk humbly. Not just, well, okay, God, I'm willing to have a God experience in the Garden of Gethsemane, but other than that, kind of back off. No, sometimes it's in the bingo hall. So that's the reality. That's what 3DM has looked like for me. You're about to hear 3 more stories from Andrea, Noramy, and Norm, and hopefully that will help give you a fully picture of some of the things that we've been doing over the last 3 years.
Good evening. I'm feeling slightly nervous this evening. I'm normally used to speaking with a small group of 12 kindergarten children, so you're a little bit bigger than they are. But I will do my best not to let my nerves get the better of me. I was asked to share with you about how being part of the ReLearning community at Leamington United Mennonite Church has transformed me. One of the most significant parts of ReLearning for me has been the Kairos moments. Kairos moments are times in my life where I feel God is calling me to stop and listen, to reevaluate what direction my life is taking. It might be an incident that happened at school or home, a dream I have had, or a strong feeling about something. At other points in my life, I would have tossed these feelings aside and just told myself to battle through them. Now I stop, listen, question, share, plan, in an attempt to figure out what Jesus is saying to me and how he wants me to continue on with my life. My first Kairos moment since being a part of the ReLearning community was reevaluating my career, asking, was I being called to do something different with my life? This Kairos moment has since blossomed into figuring out who I am as a child of my Heavenly Father. As I work through my Kairos, I share ideas and questions with the members of my ReLearning group, which we also call a huddle. I am often given insight and ideas from these people that I might not have thought about, or they have a different way of looking at my kairos than I do. These other people are also learning to be disciples for Jesus and are working through their own kairos moments. We keep each other accountable in listening to Jesus through prayer and Bible reading, and by asking each other accountability questions each time we get together. I have learned that I need to be ready to listen to Jesus. Listening isn't something that comes quickly or easily. It takes time and intentional meditation, praying, and Bible reading. Intentionally working through my kairos has strengthened my prayer life and inspired me to spend more time in the Word. I have more confidence in myself as a disciple of Jesus and feel excited as I witness to those around me. I have many opportunities to do this as I gather with the junior youth girls once a month and listen to their dreams, life stories, excitements, and concerns. My daily loving and nurturing of my own children as they grow up and learn what it means to be disciples of Jesus. Being a supportive wife to my husband, who is also in my huddle. And especially at school, where I love and nurture the little children in my kindergarten class by working hard at seeing their strengths and the positive parts of them, even the most difficult ones. This week was an interesting experience for me when one of my most difficult students decided that he was really angry that his plant wasn't growing, and I was able to tell him that plants need love and care. At the end of the day, he was blowing them kisses and telling them he loved them. One of my favorite Bible passages in this season of my life is from Matthew 11:28-30. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. If I'm working together with Christ, then I have nothing to fear. I don't have to do life alone. I don't have to do work alone. I am my Heavenly Father's daughter. Thank you.
Good evening. I think we can, good evening. We're going to try a little bit better. Good evening. Thank you. That's a tradition we have at First Mennonite. Every time I get up, I say good morning, and it's expected that you reply, and so it helps with my nervousness, so thank you. Before ReLearning Community, I was very unsure of what God was saying to me and asking me as a child of His. Since ReLearning Community, I have been more attentive to God's calling and being able to discern what it is He is asking of me. It has allowed me to become closer, not only in my own relationship with God, but also closer to the youth that I work with and other members of my congregation. A beautiful and wonderful thing that has come out of ReLearning Community has been a group of us that have attended the workshops meet once a month and share a meal. We usually have soup together, and so it's been called Soup Group. Once we've shared our meal, which usually includes soup and bread and veggies and delicious dessert made by members of the group, we go around the circle and we share something that we are grateful for and something that we have a prayer request for. The sharing time has also been practical in the time that I've spent with the youth, and we instill it, and we do it every time we have an organized activity and we have some time in between. It has been amazing to watch people be vulnerable and open and honest about their sharing, about their gratitude, but also about their prayer request. ReLearning Community has been energizing to me because it has allowed me to be okay with the skills that I have and the skills that I bring to my group, not just my ReLearning Community group, but my congregation, and celebrate them rather than try to find the skills that I lack. It has allowed me to stop to listen to God, to what God is saying to me, and in those times of listening, I've learned to be more, I have yearned to want to learn more about God and the Bible and dive deeper into the texts that I have learned when I was younger. For me, my up My relationship with God has gotten stronger. I find myself meditating more and trying to spend more time with God and listening to what he's saying to me rather than be off on my phone playing a mindless game of Candy Crush, which is so addicting but unnecessary. My relationship with my community has grown. I often, so I'm the youth leader at First Mennonite. I struggled really hard with the first couple of years of not having the gifts that I thought I needed to be a youth leader. So that included not being able to sing very well. And my Bible knowledge is not the greatest. Even though I'm a pastor's kid, you would think otherwise. And so with ReLearning Community, I learned by listening to God and asking the question of what is God saying to me and what am I going to do about it? That God has created me in his image and I have all the skills and gifts that I need to be successful. I do not need to look or put myself down for not having the gifts that I think I should have, but be happy with the ones that I do have. I have learned to walk alongside Jesus and be a disciple, which means being open to not knowing everything, but knowing that God is leading and he in fact knows all. My out has been working with the youth. I have several youth who are non-believers or who don't come to the group with the same background knowledge of Jesus and God. For me, ReLearning Community has been significant and has taught me the best way to teach is through life on life, which is walking alongside someone or letting them walk alongside you. So I've let lots of youth into my home and into my life of outside of the church, and this is with the acknowledgement that I am not perfect, but that is not the point. Being a disciple is leading by example. Thank you.
Okay, activity for you. All of you got a ministry partner book. Take that out. You all got a pen, and I found out that there's blank pages, so nobody has an excuse that you don't have anything to write on. Now, what I want you to do on your blank piece of paper is I want you to draw your neighborhood. I want you to draw your street. The street that you live on, if you're one of those people who's blessed to live in a place that has multiple acres around you, where are you, Lloyd? You told me that you lived on 11 acres. I'm envious of you. If you live on a place like that, your drawing has to be bigger. For those of you who live on a street, draw your block, draw your neighborhood. If you live in an apartment building, draw your floor of your apartment building. And I want you to do something. I want you to draw where all the houses are. Try to shape the houses the way they are. And then the third thing I want you to do is I want you to write the names of the people that live in those houses. Okay? Work on that. And I'm going to tell you a story. Rose and I, along with our 4 boys, have been living in Listowel for 6 years. And 3 years ago, somebody asked me to draw my neighborhood. And 3 years ago, somebody asked me to draw the houses on my street. And then 3 years ago, somebody said, now put the names down of the people who live there. And I said, but I'm the pastor of a decently sized church. There's like 140 people there on a Sunday morning. If you pull in the lists of all those people who are sort of connected to the church, it's over 200. I've got enough to do. I don't have time. I can't get to know my community. And then Ben Rook is sitting in our huddle together, and Kevin and I were in the same huddle together, and Ben says, I want you to take a couple of minutes to silently ask God what he's doing to mess with you today. And the only question that stuck with me is, who is your person of peace? Who is your person of peace? See, in Luke 10 and in Matthew 10, the story is told in both places, Jesus does this weird thing. He sends his disciples out to all of the towns and villages that he's about to go, and he tells them, go without a purse, without a bag, without sandals. I want you to be vulnerable as you go. And I heard Jesus saying to me, will you be vulnerable and step into your community? Because your person of peace lives there. And so I said, God, okay, I'll take a risk. I'll step out of my comfort zone. I'll open my front door. I'll actually walk out. And I'll go to my neighbor and introduce myself. But who do I go to, God? Which one of my neighbors do I go to? And so God said, let me figure that out. And so I made myself vulnerable. I said, okay, God, I'm ready to do this. Where do you want me to go? Today, 3 years later, I can tell you the names of every single person on my block, of every single person on my street. But I can tell you something more. The last thing that I want you to write down something beside each of the names that you wrote down, something that you only know because you've been a part of their life. I know my community because God led me to a person of peace. I know that person of peace because somebody held me accountable and said, I need you to take a risk, to step out of your comfort zone and allow God to mess with you. And I'm going to check up on you every couple of weeks.